Hi, everyone. I think this is probably a good time for us to get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the Green Energy Institute's webinar on the clean energy transition, quitting fossil fuel gas, and thank you for participating in the U.S. Climate Action Week. I'm Akriti Bhargava. I'm a second-year law student at Lewis and Clark Law School with a specific focus on energy law and electrification, and I will be your moderator for the next hour. As you listen to our wonderful panelists this afternoon, I invite you to submit any questions you have using the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom app. And we will reserve some time at the end for the prepared programming to answer as many of those questions as we can. Now it's my pleasure to briefly introduce our panelists. First, you will hear from Tariqa Powell. Tariqa is an energy consultant and former Sightline Institute policy researcher and speaker. She is extremely knowledgeable about fossil fuel infrastructure development, public safety, land use management and equity, and how energy policy affects environmental justice for working communities and communities of color. Tariqa received her bachelor and master's of education degrees from Oberlin College and a law degree from Vanderbilt University Law School. After that, you will hear from Professor Melissa Powers. Professor Powers is the Jeffrey Bain Faculty Scholar and Professor of Law here at Lewis and Clark Law School. She is also the director of the Green Energy Institute. She earned a bachelor's degree from the University of California at Berkeley and is a graduate of Lewis and Clark Law School. She is the author of a forthcoming article on natural gas lock-in, which if you'd like access to, you can email us and we'll get that over to you. Finally, Allison Seal is a Sierra Club attorney working on building electrification policies and programs in California, who is helping to expand the work nationally. Allison obtained her bachelor's degree from Williams College, and she earned a master's in science, specializing in energy and resources, as well as a law degree from the University of California at Berkeley. So with that, let's get started. Tariqa, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and get my presentation shared. We can see that, correct? Okay. So today we're going to be talking about quitting fossil gas, also known as natural gas, also known as fracked gas. It is a fossil fuel of many names. And one that I have spent the last 6 years now researching and writing about. So first, I'm going to talk about some lessons from the Thin Green Line, which is the Northwest opposition to fossil fuels. We call it the Thin Green Line. Over the last decade, a little more actually now, we have been the Northwest has been very involved in fighting off large-scale fossil fuel infrastructure, which is surprising probably to people who know where fossil fuel deposits actually are located in this country, because they're not in the Pacific Northwest. So it's really an accident of geography that the Pacific Northwest was faced over the last decade or so with lots of large-scale coal, oil, specifically oil by rail, and fracked gas export projects. So you have in the interior of the United States and Canada, landlocked fossil fuel deposits seeking a market. And the most energy hungry markets currently are in Asia. And the easiest way, cheapest way actually to get those products to Asian markets is to build refineries and processing plants in Oregon, Washington, and BC, pipe it over to Cascadia or send it by rail to be processed and loaded and then sent to Asian markets. And so in that time, the last 10 years, we have fought off things like the world's largest coal plant, the world's largest methanol plant. Seemingly the world's largest everything was trying to be located in the Pacific Northwest. And so we had our hands very, very busy fighting off of these projects, which really came in waves. So first wave was coal, then oil by rail, and then fracked gas, which presented some unique challenges because everyone is aware of the problems with coal. Everyone's aware of how dirty it is. Everyone's aware of problems with oil and oil transportation, like oil spills. but not a lot of people in the public have knowledge about what's wrong with natural gas, which is what most people call it. So that presented some unique challenges when the third wave came around. Here, I just wanted to briefly show some of the projects that came up in Oregon and Washington. There were 8 proposals for facilities to produce products that were derived from the natural gas supply stream. Some of these projects are dead now. The Thin Green Line has been very successful in opposition to fossil fuel projects. But I just wanted to show a history of the proposals, not just the proposals that are currently still standing. So we have proposals for methanol plants, which produce precursors to make plastics. And we have proposals for LNG plants. And just north of the border in BC, they had a lot more proposals than you see here. They had at some point almost 24 proposals just for liquefied natural gas facilities. That's not counting propane terminals, methanol, or anything like that, just strictly liquefied natural gas. They had almost 24 in British Columbia, and most of those are dead now. So this is some of what we were looking at being proposed in the region. And here's the pipelines that would have been associated with those facilities. Remember, I said that you're dealing with landlocked resources that need to get over to the coast. And so for those that would be shipped by pipeline, here is the pipelines you would have been looking at. And some of these pipelines are 800 miles long. And all of them, every single one, in fact, affects multiple Indigenous or First Nations communities, usually without meaningful consultation, or would involve the takings of homeowner land under eminent domain for the projects. So this is the landscape of projects that we were fighting against in the Pacific Northwest. So in that fight, one of the main things that we did was a rebranding of natural gas, because we realized that when you're calling it that, you're already starting off at a deficit from a messaging perspective, because it has the word natural right there in it, and that sounds pretty good. And we realized that sort of put us at a disadvantage in trying to educate people about what it actually was. And so we decided to stop calling it that, and we started calling it fracked gas, and I'll get to the reason in just a moment. Fossil gas is a term that's also used, especially in Europe. And obviously you can see that doesn't present the same problem as natural gas does. So one of the things that we have had to do in terms of fighting fracked gas projects, fighting against them getting locked in to infrastructure, is clarifying the landscape of fossil fuels, clarifying for people that fossil fuels are not just coal and oil. There's actually 3 of them. It's coal, oil, and fracked gas, or natural gas. And dispelling for people the bridge fuel myth. A lot of you are familiar with that myth that natural gas is a bridge fuel. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But some of the difficulties were that, there's first the messaging difficulty, that you're working with something that has the word natural in the name. You're fighting something with the word natural in the name. And then there's a difficulty that to explain to people why natural gas is actually not a clean fuel, it requires you to explain a lot of science, and to do so with precision. And the average person is not leaving their home to come to science, math, and geography lectures. And so that presented the issue when we first started talking about it, and how do you talk about it in a way that doesn't turn people off by how sciencey it sounds, but also to be very specific and precise in presenting the information, because misinformation is the issue that we're fighting. So it's not something that we want to contribute to. And so there was a lot of science education required on what fracking is and what the problems are with methane which is the gas that is the primary component of fracked gas. Another issue that we had is that the messaging from the fracked gas industry, I will say fossil fuel industry actually has very much misinformed the public. So you're going up against several decades of embedded misinformation. Another issue is in fighting against fracked gas becoming embedded in our infrastructure is that a lot of environmental orgs have in the past partnered with natural gas companies in order to reach their goals of reducing coal use in the United States. And that's because the old science that we had on natural gas, say in the 70s and 80s, it did not encapsulate the methane problem. At that point, we did not understand the methane problem of fracked gas. And additionally, in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't fracked. so it's very much changed. The fossil fuel that a lot of people think they're familiar with when they talk about natural gas is not what we're dealing with today. It is the same substance. It's not derived in the same way. And we know a lot more now about the problems that it causes. And lastly, of course, when you are in any fight that you're doing with the fossil fuel industry, you're up against powerful lobbies, a lot more money than you have, and people with a lot more political access. So the work that I did for 5 years with Sightline Institute, it's a policy think tank based in Seattle. I loved working there. It's very independent from those issues I talked about earlier with being embedded with industry. It's a nonprofit, completely independent. And so I didn't, in my work, really have to tiptoe around anything or anyone, which was wonderful. But, you know, being a small nonprofit of about 10 people with a limited budget is nothing like being a very powerful and moneyed fossil fuel company. But we did well anyway. So here is I want to present a little bit of the conversation around why we call it fracked gas and the work that we had to do to get people to understand that this is not natural and to understand why are we fighting against it. That was the main question that people would raise initially when we started getting into this area. Why are you fighting natural gas? Well, because we did research on it. And so what we know today, if you look at on the right, I have a chart there that is basically, it's just a geographical layout of, you know, the surface of the earth and underneath where fossil fuel deposits are. And you're not going to be tested on this. I put it up there so that you could see a little bit of what I was talking about in terms of having to teach people science and geography to explain the issues that were going on. And I put that there just to demonstrate a couple of facts. So a lot of people associate fracking with oil, but actually much more of the natural gas that we produce in this country comes from fracking. So 2/3 of US natural gas comes from fracking, whereas 50% of US oil comes from fracking. So in terms of production, it's much more strongly associated with natural gas. And most people do not know that. A second issue with the fact that now the majority of the natural gas we produce in this country comes from fracking is that in the past, one of the selling points of, I'm going to switch here between fracked gas and natural gas, and I really hate it because I prefer to just always call it fracked gas. But one of the issues is that when natural gas is sold to the public, it's as an alternative to fossil fuels that consume a lot more water. When you're producing energy from coal and oil, it is very water intensive. And in the past, producing electricity from natural gas pretty much had a net zero water consumption. You didn't really need to use much water to extract it or to process it. That has changed with fracking. Water consumption for producing electricity from gas has drastically increased because there's so much water required in the fracking process. That fracking process then produces a lot of contaminated wastewater, which no one's tracking where it's going. It's winding up in surprising places. It's being sold as to municipalities that are not aware that they're buying toxic wastewater. For example, there was a Midwestern state, and I cannot remember, and I don't want to misstate which state it was, but they purchased some saline water to de-ice their roads. So when you inject the water into the ground, a lot of it comes back up. It comes up highly saline with a lot of salt in it, as well as with a lot of chemicals. And so it's being sold to this municipality and others to help them de-ice their roads. And they actually had no idea that this was actually fracking wastewater, that they are just like putting all over their roads, their public roads, and then it's then going into runoff water and the water supply. And that's because it's very poorly regulated and no one's tracking it. And so this is one of the issues that we had to teach the public about, and we still have a lot of work to do. We're really ahead of the curve in the Northwest, but nationally, there's still a lot of work to do. The other, this slide actually, I'm not going to ask you to read it whatsoever. I just have it here to point out some specific numbers on fracking water use. If you look just down the middle column of numbers where you see some bold numbers, 70 to 140 billion gallons of water are used each year for fracking. And on the very bottom, where you look at percentages, the fracking industry will say, well, it's not that much chemicals, actually, only 0.5 to 2% of that 140 billion gallons of water is chemicals. But if you add that up cumulatively, then you're looking at 330 tons of chemicals being injected into the earth every year because of fracking. And so this is the type of, the previous slide I showed you is where we have to teach geography and science. And then we're also going into a lot of math numbers when you are trying to educate people about fracked gas. And this is one of the things that makes it easier for the industry to embed this fossil fuel, because you have to do so much work to get people to understand why we should not embed this fossil fuel. The second issue, besides the fracking with fracked gas, is methane. Methane is the primary component of natural gas, and it is shipped from one place to another via pipeline. Those pipelines age and they start leaking all over the place, and a gas leaks very easily. So methane is leaking, we now know, into the atmosphere from fracked gas infrastructure across the country. And when methane leaks into the atmosphere, it's 84 times more potent than CO2 over a 20-year time frame. It's 84 times more potent at trapping heat in the atmosphere. So we have natural gas or fracked gas being sold as an alternative to dirtier fossil fuels, but its air emissions, which are leaking from the infrastructure, are actually 84 times better at trapping heat in the atmosphere than CO2. So we're looking at natural gas as a decarbonization strategy, but methane is actually worse than the CO2 we're trying to wean ourselves off of. And I said that it's 84 times more potent over a 20-year time frame. That's because after about 13 years, methane breaks down into CO2 and water. So I repeat again, we're using natural gas as a decarbonization strategy, although it leaks methane, which is way worse than CO2 for roughly 20 years. And then thereafter, it becomes CO2. It's completely illogical. But one of the ways in which the industry makes this conversation very convoluted is that they say, well, you can't look at it over a 20-year time frame. If you know anything about air emissions, you should look at it over a 100-year time frame. Well, if you look at it over a 100-year time frame, which factors in 80 years in which the methane is no longer in the atmosphere because it's become CO2, then it's approximately 30 times worse than CO2. And so, you know, the industry will a lot of times get environmentalists caught up in the conversation of 20 years versus 100 years, when the actual point is that the best you can say for your product is that it's only 30 times worse. That's not a good argument. Secondly, climate scientists are telling us we don't have 100 years, we have about 20. So to me, that is the number that I prefer to focus on. But for the sake of accuracy, I do typically talk about 20-year and 100-year timeframes. But so methane is a big problem.
Tariqa, can I jump in here real quick? I was hoping to pull in Professor Powers to talk a little bit more about some of the lock-in around these fossil fuels, and then we can come back to this during the Q&A if that's...
Oh, have I already? Okay. Yes.
No worries. But if you wanted to conclude really quickly, you can take a couple seconds.
I will conclude very quickly.
Thanks.
I got so excited. So, okay. I think we're going to send these slides out. So, so let me just say that in terms of educating people about why we don't need to lock into fracked gas, we're up against a, like I said, very powerful, very well-funded industry that has decades old messaging. They're currently, you know, pushing to younger audiences through contracts with singers and recording artists that I see on social media, little videos promoting natural gas. When I went to see Black Panther movie a couple of years ago, there was a natural gas commercial that came on before the movie. And I literally shouted in the movie theater, "Those are lies!" Everyone, I'm sure no one listened to me. I wonder why. It's a greenwashing of the project to make it seem cleaner than it is. And the industry wants you to believe that natural gas can be a bridge between fossil fuels and renewables, and it would just be a temporary situation to use natural gas. But scientists now tell us that if there was an opportunity to use a bridge, we've passed that window. And finances tell us that the amount of money being invested in this infrastructure means that it would need to be long-term and not short-term. So I apologize for going over a little bit, but the rest of the presentation will be available for people to read through, and we could get through to some of it later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tariqa, for setting the stage for some of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to be talking a bit about this concept of lock-in, which Tariqa mentioned a couple of times. And I'm going to describe why natural gas arguably presents the greatest risk of what's known as carbon lock-in in comparison to both coal and even oil, in part because of the multi-scalar nature of natural gas infrastructure. The fact that, as Tariqa mentioned, we're not just talking about infrastructure at the wellhead, we're not just talking about pipelines, we're not just talking about power plants, we're not just talking about stoves at the distribution level, we're talking about all of them. And collectively, that expansive and multi-scalar nature of the gas sector tends to make natural gas a much stickier type of fuel than we see in terms of coal, which is dominant primarily only in the power sector, and even oil, which is predominant mostly in the transportation sector. So to explain this a little bit more, I'm going to introduce, first of all, this concept of carbon lock-in. So carbon lock-in is basically a specific analysis of something that's known as path dependency. And path dependency refers to the basic idea that once we head in a direction, we as humans tend to stay in that direction. I explain this in my classes with my students just by invoking what probably almost all of us has done, which is when we are on a hike or if we're heading in a certain direction, at some point when we realize we maybe have headed the wrong way, it is actually really hard to turn around. Instead, if you're on a hike, you think, oh, maybe if I go just a little further, I'll come around to a turnaround point. People, when they're driving, tend to not stop and ask for directions, but persist in the direction in which they're headed. This type of human behavior, known as path dependency, is also a behavior we see in terms of our investment in infrastructure. So when we think about path dependency in the energy phase, what we often think about is at the beginning of any type of technological innovation point, there tend to be a lot of different designs, there tend to be a lot of competitors, but those competitors over time get weeded out. And at some point, we end up with very few options and very few resources. That's the lock-in phase. And there are several contributors to this lock-in phase. But if we don't address the lock-in phase, then we can end up at a situation in which it can be very hard to break lock-in. I'll talk a little bit about breaking lock-in, but Allison will mostly be focusing on that breaking component. So what are the drivers in terms of lock-in? Well, a number of researchers beginning in 2000 began to publish analyses of what lock-in looked like. The first paper about carbon lock-in was published by a scholar named Gregory Unruh, and since then he and a number of other people have identified other drivers. So the first two sets of drivers are technology and infrastructure combined with institutional lock-in. And as I'll explain, those two in particular tend to both protect what becomes a dominant design of technology, and then through institutions, they tend to reify it, they tend to reinforce it, and actually amplify that technology through institutional mechanisms. Some of those institutional mechanisms are more political, some of them are more behavioral, but a lot of those are legal. And so the legal regime creates a great deal of lock-in, as well as human behavior, and then ultimately the narratives that reinforce that human behavior. So before we talk about the gas system specifically, I'll just introduce a couple of these drivers. So the Gregory Unruh's paper about carbon lock-in gave us the example of the electric vehicle, which was initially designed at the same time that the internal combustion engine was. And ultimately, what ended up happening is there was a dominant design as between the internal combustion engine over here, produced by Henry Ford, in comparison to the electric vehicle. Now, what created that dominant design? It was actually just a matter of happenstance that it turned out that the internal combustion engine gained a slight edge. And then that edge ultimately resulted in Henry Ford then developing the assembly line production system. And once you had the slight emergence of the internal combustion engine combined with the production technology, then what ended up happening is all of the other infrastructure and technologies began to orient themselves in the direction of the internal combustion engine. So what do I mean by those supporting designs? Well, companies began to manufacture different parts for the automobile. They began to develop, for example, wheels and sell wheels separately. They began to develop different types of pipes, and steel manufacturing went into developing the steel necessary to develop the automobile, and so forth. And so you begin with a single design, and then you have a bunch of supporting designs begin to develop. At the same time, you begin to have supporting infrastructure. So in the case of the automobile, first of all, there were fueling places for the gasoline, as well as roads that basically allowed the vehicle to be used in a more pervasive way. Now, as these technological and infrastructure systems began to develop, we then began to see institutional and economic and political lock-in, which basically are treated as a single type of lock-in in the institutional level. And so what we begin to see, for example, in the case of the automobile, is we began to see the beneficiaries of automobiles and regulators begin to support the type of business model initially developed by Henry Ford and then by other automobile companies. What did these regulators do? Well, they enabled, for example, increased development of roads. They began to provide different types of economic incentives for automobiles to be used and sold and eventually manufactured in certain locations. As the manufacturing process began, then we began to see labor and labor unions develop to support the industry upon which they were also dependent. We also began to see customers really wrap around the automobile through, for example, not just buying vehicles, but then forming automobile clubs where they would have races and Sunday drives, et cetera. So we began to get the institutional development of consumer-based institutions that allow automobiles to gain an even greater hold. And then throughout this, we have lobbyists and lawmakers also supporting that institution. Now, with the automobiles, the combination of technology and institution were really enough to allow the internal combustion engine to take hold. But with a lot of other types of technology, especially in the energy system, we see other types of systems enable lock-in to become more pervasive. For example, when we realize that a technology like coal might not be optimal, in terms of the environmental and human health and more recently climate impacts, the typical approach to addressing these problems is through gradualism. So gradual emissions reductions or gradual requirements in terms of technological innovation. We see this in particular under legal regimes that regulate air pollution through a mechanism known as grandfathering. Grandfathering basically protects incumbents from having to install pollution control and only regulates sources when they're new or when they go through a major modification. While grandfathering is designed to ease in different restrictions, in practice, what it ends up often doing is allowing existing actors to remain unregulated for a longer period of time. That incumbency protection then locks out other would-be competitors because they are subject to more pollution control standards and other economic requirements. Another type of legal regime lock-in is what we see in the electricity and the natural gas sector, which is monopoly protection. And under our way of regulating both the significant portion of the electric sector as well as the natural gas distribution side, we treat those businesses that provide those services as essential service providers, which of course on the one hand they are, but we protect them from competition by giving them the right to operate as regulated monopolies, and then we compensate them for developing new infrastructure. The more infrastructure they build, the greater a return they get through a particular rate-making formula that we use to regulate both electric and gas utilities. And then finally, not only do we give a great deal of protection, but we also have takings law, which has been interpreted to basically require in a number of different contexts, the government to compensate when it wants to take away some type of infrastructure or property. Now, takings law isn't always that big of a hurdle, but it's often perceived by regulators as being a hurdle, and therefore they move in the direction of gradualism. Now, the last component of lock-in is human behavior and narrative or discourse. Now, in terms of human behavior, just as I mentioned, when we get lost on hikes, we tend towards inertia. We don't like change. We stay in a direction once we point ourselves in that direction. We have what behavioral scientists refer to as a status quo bias. We also are irrational economic actors. We tend to regulate human behavior through economic instruments. What do I mean in terms of irrational economic actors? Well, one example is we all tend to succumb to what's called the sunk cost fallacy, meaning once we make an investment in something, even if we shouldn't maintain that investment, we do. just because we have a really hard time accepting that we've paid for something that maybe wasn't the best investment. We see this play out just not only in human behavior. Once you buy something, you're going to use it, and you're very hesitant to end its useful life early. But we also see this in big infrastructure. We talk a lot in the energy system, for example, about stranded costs. And the idea that if a utility has made an investment in infrastructure, we should make sure that infrastructure stays online for at least its economically useful life. In the case of energy infrastructure, we're talking about 40 to 50 years at the power plant and pipeline level. So that means that if we're acting economically irrationally, we're going to keep infrastructure online well longer than we should. And then the last component of lock-in is the narrative. And the narrative basically is any narrative that suggests that the decisions that we've already made are good. We listen to that narrative a lot better than we listen to the narrative that says that the decisions we've made, maybe even if they were good at the time we made them, are no longer good. And so we want narrative that reinforces our decisions. We don't like narrative that goes against our decisions. So if we take all of those components, and I'm going to not go through the full remainder of our conversation here, but I'll just highlight a couple of quick things. The first is just that we've built a massive amount of technology, and technological and infrastructure lock-in say that that technology is going to remain in place. In fact, if we look at these slides, this just shows how many new gas plants were added in the United States. And the gas plants on the upper left is reflected in the brown. The gas plants on the bottom slide are reflected in blue. Don't ask me why EIA changes its colors for each energy resource. But the big point here is that we have built a whole lot of new natural gas plants that are designed to last in the United States for a very long period of time. And so if we have that technological buildup, the infrastructure is going to lock in. We then have institutions that have been developed to support that technological development, including the steel industry, which has building a lot of pipelines. We have unions again and others in the industry supporting the maintenance of that industry. We have consumers and users that are, first of all, they've made investments and they don't want to see their furnaces come out or their stoves come out prematurely. But we also, as I'll show you in just a minute, have a lot of narrative around continued use of at-home infrastructure. And then we have a whole landowner base that is getting royalties and rents from natural gas extraction, and they don't want to see their revenue streams dried up. And then finally, of course, there's a big institution in terms of lawmakers and lobbyists, making sure that gas lock-in is persistent. So I'll finish just with a couple of things that Tariqa touched on, which is this behavior and discourse, and the fact that we have been talking about gas for quite a long time as a bridge fuel. The idea was we were going to replace coal with gas, and then at some point we're going to replace gas with renewables. And this might be what we end up doing, but there is a risk at the same time that we are going to rely instead on discourse that promotes maintenance of gas infrastructure over a longer period of time. As Tariqa mentioned, there are a number of different ads that are coming out, again, in favor of cooking with gas. These are just some images on the left about very well-known chefs that are being quoted as saying that gas is a great resource for cooking. And then in the wake of the Texas power outages, there have been a lot of different think pieces about people who are saying, I'm worried about gas stoves, but I'm more worried about having no fuel in my home in the next big storm. And so if we are using both the sexiness of cooking with gas and the fear of not having fuel for the home, we could see that this discourse is going to lead to even greater lock-in. So I'm going to go ahead and end there because my presentation is sort of painting a picture of how we could get stuck, but Allison is going to talk about how we might reach this point in the system and actually break out of the lock-in that we have today. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take questions if we have a little time at the end. Allison, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Melissa. Let me share my screen with everyone. So yeah, as Melissa alluded to, I'm going to be speaking about how eliminating gas in the building sector by electrifying buildings is a key component of a successful clean energy transition. You know, as Melissa kind of alluded to, this is a big change, and there may be some natural tendencies that keep us locked into this path, but electrifying our buildings is definitely something we need to do if we're going to address the climate crisis. Yeah, so I guess there are two main reasons why Sierra Club is so focused on building decarbonization and building electrification. And the first is the climate. I think as both Melissa and Tariqa have should be abundantly clear to you based on their presentation so far, we are not going to be able to address the climate crisis until we stop burning gas. And it may not be intuitive that the gas that we burn in our homes or in buildings is a significant contributor to this problem, but it is. You know, buildings account for about 1/3 of the gas sales in the United States, as you can see from the graph on this slide. And that ratio is actually similar in Oregon, where many of you may be. In California, where I'm based, we actually rely so heavily on gas for cooking and for space and water heating that today we burn more gas in our homes and buildings than in the gas power plants in the state. And I briefly, for folks outside of California and Oregon, I wanted to address a question I often hear, which is whether this transition of electrifying buildings is really a good idea when other states may have still coal on their electricity grid, or they may not have as many renewables as we have currently in California. And basically the answer is yes, this is something that we're ready to do in all states across the country right now, and which will have a climate benefit. And that is because heat pumps, and when we talk about electrification, we're talking about heat pump space and water heating, which I'll get into in a couple of slides, are an incredibly efficient technology. They can be 300 to 500 times more efficient than their gas counterpart. And as a result, you see greenhouse gas savings across the country, even in states, you know, that still have coal on their grid. As you can see in this chart here, electrifying the average home in the United States will reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from heating by about 45% over the life of that appliance. The second main reason that we need to electrify buildings is for our health and for public health. You know, as Tariqa was discussing, it's called natural gas. You know, that gives the impression that it's clean, but combusting a fuel inside your home is not clean. It's not good for you. And, you know, gas appliances don't have pollution controls like a gas power plant. And so as a result, you know, they will emit 5 to 6 times more nitrogen dioxide than a gas power plant for each unit of gas burned. So Sierra Club actually sponsored a study from UCLA where they found that after cooking for 1 hour with a gas stove and oven, the concentrations of nitrogen dioxide inside the home actually exceeded both California and national acute air quality standards. As you can see on this graph here. And, you know, this is a very serious environmental equity and justice issue, because this problem is going to be more acute in small homes and small apartments, in homes that don't have good ventilation in the kitchen, maybe households where people are using their oven for supplemental heating. And these are all situations where the residents are more likely to be low income, you know, more vulnerable population segments. Electrification has a bunch of additional benefits that I don't have a slide on, but I'm just gonna briefly run through them. You know, just like energy efficiency, if we do this right, we improve people's comfort in their home. We especially when we combine this with weatherization programs, we can lower your energy bills. It supports the integration of renewable energy because these new loads that we're adding are very flexible. They can soak up excess renewables. And of course, we're eliminating the risk of explosions from our gas infrastructure. Just very briefly, I wanted to show you the technologies that we're talking about when we talk about electrifying buildings. We're talking about heat pump, space, and water heating. So heat pump may seem like a foreign term, but everyone on this webinar has a heat pump in their home right now, which is your refrigerator. It's just an appliance that either transfers, warm air or cool air from one place to another, transferring heat out of your fridge, transferring heat from the air into your tank of water. And because it's just transferring heat and not creating it as you would do through combustion, these appliances, are incredibly efficient. So yeah, just to switch tacks now, I wanted to talk about the advocacy priorities that Sierra Club and some of our partners in this work have to advance building electrification. And the first objective of this work is to halt the expansion of the gas system, just as Melissa and Tariqa have been talking about. One way that we can do that is by ensuring that any new buildings that are constructed are all electric. We are working on that here in California as part of our advocacy for a 2022 building code that will set all electric buildings as the standard design. You may also have heard about many efforts in California and elsewhere in the country to require new buildings to be all electric within cities or municipalities. So maybe you've heard about the gas ban passed by the city of Berkeley. They were the first, but at this point, there are 42 other cities and municipalities in California who've passed similar local ordinances. A second manifestation of this work is to ensure a thoughtful transition off of the gas system. As we are successful, as the demand for gas declines, gas utilities either need to raise their rates or invest less in their system. And we obviously need to make sure that the people left on the system are not stuck with unaffordable bills or unjustifiable safety risks. So this type of work means engaging in dockets that deal with long-term gas system planning for a thoughtful transition, or utility requests to upgrade their pipes in a way that allows us to address safety and environmental issues while still not overly investing in a system that is soon going to be obsolete. Finally, we want to push back on gas industry efforts to promote fossil gas alternatives, which they like to call renewable natural gas, a very effective PR term for these resources, which have a lot of environmental problems. It can come from a lot of different sources, not all climate neutral, many with serious environmental harms. This is a presentation all in itself, but in the interest of time, I'll stop there and say that Sierra Club's position is that we need to save the environmentally beneficial or neutral fossil gas alternatives that we do have for end uses that cannot be electrified, thinking of things like long distance shipping. And we can't be using it in our homes where we have this very effective and affordable solution of electrification. And then the second and final major objective of our advocacy here is to ensure electrification is affordable for everyone. Low-income households, and environmental and social justice communities are going to be less likely to be able to afford the upfront costs of this transition. And we need to make sure that these households can be among the first to electrify by providing incentives, accessible financing, and addressing split incentives perhaps between renters and their landlords. We are also engaged in energy efficiency program design proceedings to make sure that energy efficiency programs have fuel neutral or greenhouse gas-based targets that are going to allow people to actually switch from an old gas appliance to a new efficient electric appliance. And then in addition, we may need new electric rate designs in many places where electric rates are high, to ensure that people who electrify are charged fairly for the beneficial electricity use that they're adding. So that was a very quick summary, but I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion and to your questions.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. So we'll jump into questions now. We have two main themes and buckets of questions that I will pose to the panelists. I also want to say, I think we might end up going a few minutes past 1 o'clock. So if folks are able to stay on, I think the panelists will be happy to take some of your additional questions. But if you need to jump off, please feel free to do that whenever we're done with the panel. So the first set of questions we received is on the renewable natural gas, and then second is about sort of all-rounded advocacy efforts for electrification and all the different moving parts that need to happen. So I'll start with Tariqa. Tariqa, can you talk to us a little bit about how overhyped are the environmental benefits of renewable natural gas, and how does renewable natural gas serve to prop up the fracked gas industry?
So renewable natural gas, to be clear, what people mean when they're talking about that is methane gas that is taken from landfills. Like methane is produced naturally, like when trash breaks down. And so there's an issue of a lot of methane being emitted by landfills, not nearly as much as by the fossil fuel industry, but it's a component. And so this is gas that is being produced in the landfills, and the idea is to capture it instead of letting it go into the atmosphere and then inject that into the natural gas distribution system. You can also get it from agricultural sources such as cow farming, anywhere you have waste breaking down. And the issue with it, is pretty obvious. When you say renewable natural gas, people have no idea that you're talking about gas that is coming from landfills and these other sources. It's like, we worked so hard to get people in the Northwest to stop calling it natural gas and start calling it fracked gas, to the point where even when journalists were writing about this, they were using that language. And then all of a sudden, here's renewable natural gas coming onto the scene. And even in the environmental community, people started using that language. And I'm like, you guys, what's not clicking? Natural is hard enough. Now we have renewable and natural next to each other, just stacking the false branding. And it's so cynical to call something that is produced by excessive landfill trash a renewable resource. And, we definitely do not need to contribute to locking in that language. And so to me, the issue is the same as when you're just dealing with natural gas. You have to go against that language and use your own language for it, because, the conversation is basically that, this is something that we can use that if we use landfill gas, I refuse to call it renewable natural gas. I haven't decided what I'm going to call it yet, but if we use that, then we're actually helping the pollution problem. But what it's leaving out is it's upholding this infrastructure that is very heavily polluting, and that methane is still ultimately, a lot of it is going to wind up in the atmosphere. And so it very much contributes to the issue of locking it in by further greenwashing and further obscuring the source of where this comes from.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so the next question, I think we can start off with Allison, and then Professor Powers and Tariqa can jump in. Allison, you talked a little bit about the work that Sierra Club and other organizations are doing at a legislative level in terms of support or pushing legislative actors to make policy that is changing. So in addition to pressure on legislative leaders, what are other things that need to be happening in tandem for electrification? For example, movement from the investment sector, community participation, litigation, et cetera. And then the second part of this question is, what type of messaging or what type of prodding can happen to get either rural populations or community members also involved in this fight?
That was a very multifaceted question. I'm going to start with the second half and talk in particular about rural communities, because I think that that is a situation where electrification could be a really promising solution. I'm thinking in particular of a pilot program happening now in California in the San Joaquin Valley, where there are a number of communities that were never connected to the natural gas system just because the cost of extending the transmission lines to those communities was prohibitive, excuse me. And so now those communities are actually going to be, the homes are going to be fully electrified instead of extending gas lines out there. And it's, hopefully going to be extremely beneficial in these areas because people were using, propane, even wood for like their home energy needs. So yeah, I think those are situations where electrification can be quite promising. I guess along those lines, going back to the beginning of your question, I think there are still like some hearts and minds to be converted among the public. Like Tarika is saying, it's the gas industry is trying to press a lot of solutions, that require less change. If we switch to renewable natural gas or fossil gas alternatives, that's my proposal for what you could call it, Tarika. That's a lot easier than replacing everyone's appliances. So I think that getting the message out there that this is home electrification is really the best solution. Over the long term, numerous studies show that it's the most cost-effective solution, and it's really what we need to do.
And what I would add on to that in terms of like messaging work around this is, again, the first thing you have to do is bring people into the conversation. You don't bring people into the conversation by hitting them over the head with numbers. You bring people into the conversation by connecting to things that they care about, that are important to them in their community. And so some of the things that I think are important to focus on if you're trying to do work to prevent this sort of lock-in is facts such as, these facilities and pipelines always disproportionately impact Indigenous communities, people of color, and low-income communities. And talk about the fracking wastewater winding up in unsuspecting communities, which are, again, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income communities. We can talk about how the endpoint policies entirely ignore the rest of the supply chain and let people know that when you're being sold a facility as green, it's only looking at the point of combustion, where natural gas does produce less CO2, about half the CO2 equivalents of, say, combusting coal. But that's only if we're looking at that one point, and we're ignoring the entire rest of the picture in order to pretend that this story is true. And I think that some of the work involves getting the communities to resist being pitted against each other, because what will happen a lot of times is that the industry will come into communities and they'll start with talking to labor and get labor on their side in the conversation. And then, other people, we don't want to go against our unions and we don't want to tear them down, but then they sort of become the stand-in for the industry. When you're not going against them, you're going against the industry. So one of the important things is calling out and identifying ways in which the industries will pit communities against each other, which Professor Powers touched on, and that it becomes embedded in certain sectors of society, and then and that makes it harder to break away from the fuel. I think that it's beneficial to highlight that, so that everyone understands the landscape of what is going on. I'm always a fan of information being powerful.
Perfect. So the next question, I think we've maybe touched on it a little bit, but if you wanted to speak a little more specifically, how did California address incumbent natural gas utilities with the passing of the all electric building? So, how are we engaging the utilities in that conversation?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, the regulations and ordinances that have been passed so far just pertain to new buildings. It doesn't, it's not pertaining to any buildings that are existing. While the utilities, a monopoly utility has an obligation to serve, Anyone in their service territory who maybe wants, natural gas service, none of us have an obligation to buy it. And there's no there's no reason why we can't say that we don't want to buy it anymore. I could speak a little bit about like the specific, I guess, how these various all electric ordinances have been passed, but that might be too in the weeds. Maybe we should get to other questions.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Okay, so I'll put this one for Professor Powers to maybe talk a little bit, with your experience with Green Energy Institute and Oregon, how are we getting our states' clean energy programs to divest themselves from promoting gas? And the person who asked this was they were talking about, for example, the Oregon Energy Trust and conversion to a gas furnace.
Yeah, and I'll probably actually touch on that, and as well as Hub's question about what's going on in Washington, and then actually Paul's question a little bit about the rate design, rate issues. So the first thing I think it's important to understand is that, in Oregon, we have the natural gas utility and we have the electric utility. And they're two separate entities that each are basically building out infrastructure. And when they build out infrastructure, they get paid whenever they make a capital investment. And then if their fuel costs are just passed on typically to the customers, but where they make their profit is by building stuff. And so one of the dynamics, though, that we have is where you have an electric utility and you have a gas utility, and you have regulators that are basically designed, they're supposed to basically try to regulate those entities while ensuring that they get sufficient investment so that they can continue to maintain their financial integrity, so that they can continue to attract investment from their stakeholders. The regulator is basically supposed to ensure effectively fuel neutrality. We have, it's referred to as a fuel switching prohibition, so that the idea is that you're not supposed to, in effect, pick off the gas company by promoting electrification. Oregon hasn't really reconciled that. And so when we're thinking about what's going on in terms of the Energy Trust of Oregon, the reason that the Energy Trust of Oregon continues to use ratepayer funding to incentivize and provide rebates on certain types of technology is because it's not allowed to do otherwise. And this, I think, is a real dilemma for our gas utility, in the sense that in terms of the future of the gas utility, simply switching from one fuel to another fuel isn't necessarily going to give them the revenues that they would need. And we really don't want to have a system where we're building out more and more and more infrastructure to eventually transition to renewable gas, especially when the upstream impacts of that renewable gas, especially when it's coming from mega dairies and mega agricultural operations. It's just not life cycle sustainable. And so I think we actually really need to start thinking about either integrating the gas utility with the electric utilities and then basically phasing it out, or doing something else where we're really confronting what is, in my view at least, an industry that at some point is going to have to wind down. And I think there are ways that we can do that, and that we should be doing it, just as we're thinking about a just transition on the consumer end, and making sure that consumers don't get stuck with infrastructure and with costs that they can't afford. We also, I think, need to be thinking about this on the industry end to make sure that workers, employees, infrastructure doesn't get abandoned, or they don't get left in the lurch. And that requires our regulators to be bold. It requires them to anticipate that we are in the midst of a change and to develop strategies to facilitate a change that is going to actually be fair for everybody. That's part of the whole just transition movement. And then the last, so that's sort of, we're just not doing it. We're not really taking that on yet. We're still treating electricity as electricity, gas as gas, and we're not really thinking about this on a holistic level. Washington is starting to propose Washington, if this bill passes, would phase out or ban new natural gas hookups in buildings. I don't think that they're getting at the existing infrastructure. And if you don't get at the existing infrastructure, you run the risk that the cost per unit of gas will increase. So I think Washington's going to have to take care of that more next step thinking, although it's good that it's thinking about the first step of not building new infrastructure. Not building new infrastructure is the way to avoid lock-in. So that's a very good thing. Last thing I'll just note is Paul asked a little bit about what is the price that we need per kilowatt hour to enable building electrification. Short answer is it depends. Slightly longer answer is that what we need to do is basically with building electrification, you're going to be building a lot of equipment, but the cost per kilowatt hour in terms of fuel costs and operational expenses will over time be much lower. But the exact amount, I don't know. And part of the reason I don't know is it really is going to depend on the cost of building, the cost of the equipment, the cost of financing, and frankly, what the expectations are of the existing utility in terms of the rates of return they're getting on their capital. So that's my big punt. It's probably going to be capital intensive for a while. And then it's going to become much more affordable over time, especially because building electrification also provides a lot more services beyond just consumption. It provides storage, it provides flexibility, it provides grid reliability. So if done right, it'll be a lot of money on the front end and it will be a lot of returns on the back end. Sorry, that was my long answer.
Yeah, if I could just jump in really quickly to say, I actually just posted a Sierra Club blog on the topic of rate design for building electrification, just dealing with the operating costs of an electrified home. So would be happy to share that with anyone who's attending.
And I want to make one last point, which is to say that although sometimes it can feel like doing the work of sort of preventing this sort of lock-in or going up against and fighting the very strong messaging of the industry can seem, like an overwhelming challenge, or maybe like it's too difficult to do. I would encourage people interested in this topic to also take a look at the finances of the industry, which are incredibly rocky right now. They actually need at this point in time to lock in. And if they are not successful in doing that, then their financial futures look very bleak. And that's why you see such a huge push. That's why you see, like on Professor Power's slides where she showed those articles about, I was going to get rid of my gas stove, but now I don't want to be without power. The fact of the matter is that in Texas, the grid is 70% coal and natural gas, and the majority of the failures there were from natural gas. But there was such a very successful public push to make people think that it was renewables that failed. And so to me, that shows, it's frustrating, but it also shows the desperation. And so I think that if we understand the financial position that the industry is in, and that it needs every bit of lock-in it can get right now, and therefore every bit of lock-in that we can prevent is incredibly helpful, then it really helps on this journey. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our incredible panelists for having these conversations with us. And I hope all the attendees had some really good takeaways from this. I've put a little message in the chat. So if you have any follow-up questions or comments that you wanted to ask any of our panelists, you can get in touch with us at gei@lclark.edu. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending. Thank you for staying on past 1 o'clock. And we hope you all have a great day. Thanks.